you okay if I use this mic? I've got some notes here, so I'm afraid that over the years I've been breathing this subject of Scotland's relationship with the European Union and the UK's relationship with the European Union. So what I'm going to do is I've tried to structure the speech more for your benefit than anybody else's, and I've got some notes here. I have some very minimal slides as well. The slides are minimal because I'm going to give you some numbers and some information, and I thought that having a visual representation of those numbers would be quite helpful for you. First of all, can I say what an absolute pleasure and a privilege it is to be here today. Thank you. And it's, I think, a particular privilege to be speaking to your class, talking about the European Union, the future of the European Union, and I think that's reflected in the multinational nature of this class. I know that it's predominantly Italian, but it's so good to see friends and colleagues and students from across Europe. That's really important. In these kind of classes, it gives us different perspectives that inhabit different parts of our shared continent. And I hope today I can give you a little bit of a perspective on what's been going on in one part of that continent, in the western outreaches, northwestern outreaches of Scotland. The subject today is Scotland's future relationship with the EU, perspectives from a reluctant outsider. Why do I use the term reluctant outsider? Well, I use the term reluctant outsider because this dominates my remarks today, is because Scotland never wanted to leave the European Union. It voted 62% in favour of remaining part of the European Union in the Brexit referendum. I'm going to come back to all of this. In the Brexit referendum in 2016. At the time, if you'd had an in-out referendum in a large number of European countries, 62% would have been quite a high number of people to be in favour of the European Union. So to do so against the backdrop of the rest of the UK, England in particular, voting to leave the European Union was a mark of confidence in the European project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is and what that might mean for the future as well, but that's the starting point of our discussion today. For me, I'm going to give you some history, because for me, and I was just remarking to Giovanni before we came in, for me, the Brexit referendum seems like a very short period of time ago, but I know it's now 6-7 years ago, which of course when you're studying, in fact all of you will have been at school when this took place, and a lot has happened since. So firstly, just as an introduction to me, and thank you to you both for your kind words, I'm a professor at the School of International Relations at the University of St Andrews, the third oldest university in the English-speaking world, the oldest university in Scotland. We have a long history with the rest of the with the rest of Europe, and St Andrews was recently said to be by The Guardian as being the #1 university in the UK. So you'll forgive me, they're my employers, so I have to say these things. They're the #1 university in the UK according to The Guardian, the #2 according to the newspaper The Times, and last year St Andrews was #1 in The Times, which was the first time that Oxford or Cambridge had been beaten in the newspaper university rankings. So I know that's not part of your studies, but that's just part of my public relations exercise for my esteemed university. And actually one which has got very long links to the rest of Europe. This isn't part of my talk, but the higher education sector is very interesting. The University of St Andrews is 600 years old, not quite as old as the University of Bologna and other universities in Italy, but still old. The university sector was one of the first areas that really tied together the different parts of our continent. They did it through academia, through learning, through productive debate and discussion like we are undertaking today. And Scotland has and has always had a separate and distinctive higher education sector. And it was interesting that scholars, when the University of St Andrews was established, didn't tend to come from Oxford or Cambridge. They tended to come from Paris, they tended to come from Italy, from Germany, and elsewhere. So this interconnectedness with the rest of Europe, and I often say this to remind a UK audience rather than one like this, is something that is not new. This is not a new phenomenon. And let me talk sorry, I think just that background in terms of the higher education sector that we all experience and we all know about is quite a useful one. In terms of my own background, I'm reasonably new to working in the academic sector, but my background was I worked in the international NGO sector on conflicts and stabilisation across the former Soviet Union, which again is another big issue for our shared continent nowadays. I then worked in the EU Committee of the Regions, working with regional governments across Europe, as well as at Scotland House in Brussels. And then I returned to Scotland, where I was an advisor to the First Minister of Scotland, that's the devolved administration, which I'll talk about shortly, advising on European and international affairs, as well as issues like energy and climate change. And then when I was elected to Parliament in 2015, I was then elected onto the Foreign Affairs Committee for 2 terms, and I was also asked to be my party, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, spokesperson on foreign and European affairs, which was a step up for our party, because in the 2015 general election in the UK, the SNP had gone from 6 seats to 56 seats and had become the third party at a UK level, even though the SNP only competes in 9% of the seats in the Westminster Parliament. So the SNP had become the dominant force in Scottish politics and the third force in terms of UK parliamentary politics. I'm going to go back a little bit more in history here as well. I'll show you my first slide, just so that you see it. There won't be many slides, but that's me in action in the House of Commons at the height of the Brexit debates, when things were incredibly difficult. I'm not sure if you all remember the mayhem and chaos that came through the UK parliamentary system. You might have watched it on the television. But over those years, it was incredibly difficult, very chaotic within the United Kingdom, has pulled the United Kingdom, it seems, has stressed the constitutional makeup of the United Kingdom to its maximum. Let me talk a little bit first about Scotland as a nation. The United Kingdom is called the United Kingdom because it's comprised of constituent parts, and this is really important when we're talking to others elsewhere in Europe. It's comprised of constituent parts of Wales, now Northern Ireland, England and Scotland. You'll all have noticed that when the Queen died recently, there was a different protocol was put into place for the death of a monarch. The first time a monarch had died in Scotland for 500 years, but a different protocol because the Queen died in Scotland. And there was a different mourning protocol, there was a different lying in state protocol, and that's because when Scotland became part, when the United Kingdom was formed through the Treaty of Union, and remember it was a treaty, it wasn't a conquest, it was a treaty that was agreed between Scotland and England, that the monarch was already in place, because in 100 years before the Treaty of Union in 1707, there had been a union of the crowns between Scotland and England, 2 ancient kingdoms that come together. And so the Queen, and now the King, remains King of Scots distinctly from being King or Queen of England. And so when the monarch died, a distinctive protocol kicked into place. Now, this might seem quite archaic, it might seem drawing upon centuries, but actually this is what builds our countries and this is what makes our constitution, especially in a country like the United Kingdom, which doesn't have a written constitution. It also means that when King Charles, and we can have our debates on whether or not we should have kings or presidents, but let's put that to one side, when King Charles as head of state is crowned, he must be crowned in Edinburgh as well as being crowned in London. That's important because if you think where we are at the moment, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the reaction of other European countries to the potential of Scottish independence, the United Kingdom is not one divisible entity, it's multiple entities. So Spain considers itself within its constitution, and again there's political debate, but constitutionally as an indivisible entity within its constitution. That is not the case in the United Kingdom. Scotland's had its own distinct identity. In fact, when the Italians came 2,000 years ago and built Hadrian's Wall, the Roman conquest never quite reached Scotland, so you can even trace it right the way back 2,000 years ago. If anybody's watched the film Braveheart, that reflects wasn't terribly accurate, but it is a helpful cultural reference. That reflects a period of time when Scotland and England went to war over independence. Scotland gained its independence. And what was important then were a number of things. Was that the Church, the Vatican, again, back in Italy, having a big role in this whole process, even in the outer edges of Europe. The Church in Rome, or it was in Avignon at the time, the Scots, as usual, backed the wrong side, but that's been a common thread throughout history. Recognised Scotland as something called a filius specialis of the Church after those wars of independence. What does that mean, a filius specialis? So forgive my Latin. That means a special daughter of the Church. Why was that important? It's because a number of people considered the Church before the Reformation as being the United Nations of its day, giving due recognition. And that's something that's continued to this day, where even today the Vatican has a distinctive conference of bishops in Scotland, distinctive from the ones in England. There are two international organisations that consider Scotland a distinctive entity. One is the Catholic Church, and the other one, of course, is FIFA. And I would argue that our membership of the Catholic Church has been somewhat more successful over the past few years than our membership of FIFA, but that's another matter. So in footballing matters and matters of faith, which are often interconnected, Scotland is seen as a distinctive entity. The Treaty of Union was part of two sovereign entities, and this has continued to this day. So the Brexit debates were very much centred around parliamentary sovereignty. So I think everybody knows that the UK becomes weaker, less economically beneficial outside the European Union, and that the UK government's own documents show that the UK would become weaker, and that's happened. You know, the British economy was 90% of the German economy's GDP in 2016. It's now collapsed down to 70%, mainly due to currency fluctuations, but reacting the weakening of the United Kingdom's economic strength in this time. So it came down to parliamentary sovereignty. What does that mean? It means that MPs in Westminster, those who were in favour of leaving the European Union, thought that there should be ultimate parliamentary sovereignty should lie in the House of Commons at Westminster. That means that no power can usurp it. So that's why they had a problem with the European Court of Justice being able to overturn laws that Westminster had created. It was why they had a problem with the Council of Ministers and the decisions it had reached. So fundamentally, if you were in favour of the European Union, and I wasn't, very strongly I wasn't, but if you're in favour of the European Union, in favour of leaving the European Union, you did so because you thought it compromised parliamentary sovereignty. So think of all the fuss, think about where we are, all on this principle of parliamentary sovereignty. But I'm going to go to the next slide, and the reason I put this quote on this slide is quite important. This is from a case in the High Court in the United Kingdom. The highest court in the United Kingdom was a case of Lord Cooper, this case of McCormack versus the Lord Advocate. This case was brought in 1953, and again, we're not lawyers, but this is quite important. This was a case that was brought in the 1950s when Queen Elizabeth II, who recently passed away, acceded the throne. And the British government wanted to refer to her as Elizabeth II. But she wasn't Elizabeth II of Scotland, because Scotland and England had not been in a union when Elizabeth I had been on the throne back in the 16th century. And what was also interesting, that this idea of parliamentary sovereignty, and you may have read it by now, was said by the court, and this court case stands, that the principle of the unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctly English principle which has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. So, again, this is so important because you see the very premise for the United Kingdom having the upheaval and leaving the European Union was done so on the basis of a premise that only exists in English law and was only refers to the English parliamentarians. And that's really important. So it's really important in how Scots see themselves. It's really important in how the UK works, and it's also important in regarding the distinctive entities that make up the United Kingdom. I'd like to fast forward a little bit to the re-establishment of the Scottish Parliament. So Scotland, and I've written about it in this book, the this is why foreign policy and what you're discussing just now is so important. One of the reasons Scotland went into, and there's a lot of history, so forgive me, and I'm not a historian. One of the reasons Scotland entered into the Treaty of Union in 1707 was that it bankrupted itself. It bankrupted itself because the Scots had decided to establish a colony in what is now Panama, because the Scots decided, well, trade is taking off around the world. If we place ourselves in Panama, then we'll be able to become rich because of the Atlantic and the Pacific trade. That colony was established somewhere which is now known as the Darien, which is the only part of the Inter-American Highway that does not connect anymore because it's so remote. It was an ill-thought-out project that was opposed by the English, who opposed it, and Scotland also very briefly went to war with our friends in Spain at the time, who were very much opposed to that. It was a failure. But Scotland had invested so much money into this project, it became bankrupt. It then agreed, but by about only 2 or 3 votes, its Parliament agreed to enter into a Treaty of Union with England and join with the English Parliament in 1707 as a consequence. So right now, the desire for Scottish independence is being driven because of how we see our relationship with our European partners and our foreign policy. And we entered into a Treaty of Union in many ways, lots of different ways, because of our foreign policy. And even prior to that Treaty of Union, the Scots had common citizenship with the French, common monarchs with the French. We even had common monarchs and citizenship with the Norwegians and the Danes. And actually Scotland's last, I'm not sure if there are any Swedes here, but Scotland's last independent foreign policy act came about in the 17th century when it backed Swedish independence against the wishes of its Norwegian and Danish neighbours. We often think in terms of politics and where lines are drawn, but one thing I'd invite you to do is if you look at a map, and I didn't include one, which I should have done, you'll see that there's no right way to look at a globe. So Scotland's foreign policy relationships, and I'll talk about this in due course, have been historically as much with the Irish, the Norwegians, the Danes, as they were with the English, the Welsh, the French, the Belgians, the Dutch. So these things change and they evolve over time. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the re-establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. I say the re-establishment because all parliamentarians recognised that there needed to be a Scottish Parliament to reflect the Scottish nation, to reflect the fact that it consistently was not voting the same way as voters in England. In 1979, there had been a referendum, and I will get up to date soon, there had been a referendum whereby 52% of Scots had voted in favour of a Scottish Assembly being established, but it didn't come to fruition because a rule was put down that 40% of the entire electorate must vote in favour of it, so it failed. Over the 1980s, civil society in Scotland, the Church of Scotland, trade unions, activists, all the political parties except the Conservative Party, then got behind establishing a Scottish Parliament. That happened in 1999. In 2007, my party, the SNP, won an independence referendum for the first time. And in 2011, the SNP won a majority of seats, which was quite interesting because it's a proportional system. And in a proportional system that was designed for there not to be a majority, the SNP won a majority in 2011, and in 2014 there was an independence referendum. That independence referendum was recognised, this is really important, the London government, and I'll come back to this again, recognised that Scotland should have its own independence referendum, and they set out the Edinburgh Agreement. The Edinburgh Agreement set out stipulations such as who could vote, how much money could be spent, but critically, that the British Parliament would recognise the outcome of that referendum. Now, the people of Scotland voted no, 55% to 45%, but the Edinburgh Agreement was really important. Prime Minister David Cameron, First Minister Alex Salmond signed that critical agreement. Since then, we've had the European referendum. Actually, no, we had the EU referendum where the UK voted to leave the EU. And although Scotland voted against independence, I'm going to go into the next slide now, I'm going to show you something. The numbers that you can see behind us are taken from something called the Social Attitude Survey. The Social Attitude Survey is something that gets done by a group of universities every year. It's government funded. Rather than being a snapshot of an opinion poll, it's a big survey that takes place that measures things like wealth attitudes. So it's seen as the gold standard of popular opinion. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the EU referendum, but what's really interesting for our talk today have been the rapidly changing rapidly changing attitudes in Scotland. So I'm going to leave this up, but if you look at 1999 when the Scottish Parliament was established, independence popularity was sitting at 27%. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'll use the laser pointer if that helps. Scottish sits at 27%, devolution 59%, and no Scottish Parliament at 10%. Now, what's interesting is that no Scottish Parliament remains the same proportion throughout the entire period of the Scottish Parliament being established. And it remains the most trusted governing institution in Scotland, so more trusted than Westminster. So I think, first of all, having a Scottish Parliament, having a distinctive Scottish political entity, is seen as the settled will. If anything's a settled will, but is seen as something that's almost uncontested now, which was not always the case. But the big changes come in this. 27% in favour of independence, now 52%, with the big change coming, starts to come in the aftermath of the 2014 referendum, but really changes after Brexit. These are really important numbers, and we know these from other figures as well. Why is this important? So, as I said before, Scotland voted overwhelmingly against leaving the European Union. England didn't. And what was interesting was there was a referendum in 1975 about British membership, whereby they voted overwhelmingly to join the European Economic Community as it was then. But these have changed. Why have they changed? I think they changed from an English perspective. English identity has been on the increase. And I'm going to switch over to the next, just so you can see this. Then I'm going to switch back to these numbers again. So, people who backed Brexit, and remember, identity is important in politics. You might not like it, but identity is really important. How people feel, how they identify. So if you felt English, you overwhelmingly backed Brexit. You overwhelmingly backed leaving the European Union. And there were a number of surveys done that people were comfortable with Scottish independence or Irish reunification if it meant they could get Brexit. There had been a rise in UKIP, the UK Independence Party, who had won the European elections in England and Wales in 2019. UKIP never even, I think it never even gained a parliamentary saved a deposit in a Scottish or general election in Scotland, and to gain a deposit means you have to get 5% of the vote. So UKIP was not a force in Scottish politics at all. So you're starting to see that distinctiveness between England and Scotland really coming in the European question. There was also a very different debate around immigration. Scotland is overwhelmingly quite pro-immigration. We're empty. A lot of our industries need, the energy industry, higher education industry, food and drink industry rely on immigration. There's also a long history of Scottish emigration. Scotland is the only country in Western Europe that has not seen a significant increase in its population for the past 100 years, the reason being that a lot of its population leave. So when you get immigration, you understand immigration. And if you go to places like the United States, I was in the United States last week, huge Scottish diaspora. Just in the same way there's a big Italian diaspora, and I was in the Italian part of Boston last week having some excellent coffee. But actually you've also seen your population rise in Italy during that period, even when people have left. So immigration, very popular, or not popular, but not unpopular. Whereas in England you've seen politics being driven by the question of immigration, as it has been in other European countries. There's another reason. In the aftermath, and all this is so relevant to the way we discuss and debate the European Union, in the aftermath of, I was elected in 2015. The first thing I had to do was to take the EU referendum bill through Parliament for my party. That meant that I made my maiden speech on the first day that I could in Parliament, so about 6 days after I was elected. I then started to be a frontbencher and take the bill through 2 weeks after I was elected. Usually it takes years, but it's because the SNP had become quite big that people like me who were new members of Parliament were being put on the front bench. David Cameron wanted that referendum, which was held in June 2016, to happen very, very, very quickly. David Cameron, as Prime Minister, made a supposition that the quicker the referendum took place, the better chance there was for a Remain vote. He was wrong. I argued, and others argued, that there should be a long campaign, because in that period you scrutinise the different debates. In Scotland, when we had our independence referendum in 2014, there'd been a campaign of 3 years. And that was really important because it gave 3 years of discussing, debating and scrutinising. Really significant, because you're asking, your vote as citizens is one of the most important and powerful mechanisms you have. Your vote, whether you use it or not, is one of your signs of citizenship. Each and every one of you, whether you like it or not, is a politician. Because you're a politician if you decide not to vote. That has a consequence. You're a politician if you decide to exercise that vote. That has a consequence. You're a politician if you decide to protest or you decide to use any one of your range of democratic rights that you enjoy as European and Italian and citizens of other countries. Part of that is taking decisions and scrutinising. And what happened was, not only did that debate come around very quickly, June 2016, so 3 months after the bill had received royal assent, it had been approved, but actually took place just 6 weeks after local elections in the UK. Now, you might think local elections. Well, there were Scottish parliamentary elections 6 weeks before, Northern Irish Assembly elections, Welsh Assembly elections, London elections, and believe me, I've been in politics. In politics, you do not campaign for an election 3 elections from now. You only ever campaign for the next election. It's like a football match. Whenever you hear the football manager say, we're not thinking about, you know, if they've got a league game on Wednesday and a cup final on Saturday, you don't hear them saying, well, we're thinking about the cup final on Saturday. Of course you don't. You think the next game. And it's the same with elections. It's always the same. So, nobody really started campaigning in the European referendum until 6 weeks before the referendum. 6 weeks before such a significant event with significant consequences. That meant, critically, there were no details about what Brexit meant. Why was that important? Well, it's important here. Leaving the European Union can mean anything. It can mean anything from a model that's like Norway's, where you're members of pretty much everything except the political institutions. Or it can mean the hardest of hard Brexits, which is a route down which the UK has gone now. And the consequences and the differences between these two models are vast, and we could have a whole discussion, which we won't, about these different models. That was never discussed. And because in the United Kingdom you have parliamentary sovereignty, it meant that the decision of what kind of Brexit sat exclusively with the House of Commons. We don't have the divisions in the UK. And interestingly, in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit referendum, the Scottish Government came up with a compromise. It said, we will put independence, because remember the Scottish Government was elected, interestingly, in 2016 on a mandate that if Scotland was taken out of the EU against its will, then the Scottish Government had a mandate for another independence referendum, although that power sits at Westminster. Now, it was re-elected in 2016. 6 weeks later, it was delivered, as SNP members would see it, it was delivered that mandate to leave the European Union. The Scottish Parliament, the SNP, won the election with a greater share of the votes and share of seats than Tony Blair, Boris Johnson even achieved in their great landslides in the UK political systems. But that was not recognised because all the sovereignty rests in the House of Commons. And actually this is where, and again it's for another debate, if all the power rests in one chamber, only one chamber decides. The House of Lords is appointed, so doesn't have any power. The head of state is a monarch, and they are there by an accident of birth, so they don't have any power. There is no division of power to this level in the United Kingdom. And that leads to dangers. It can lead to decisiveness, but leads to dangers. So the House of Commons had to agree what kind of Brexit it meant, and it couldn't agree. The Scottish Parliament, across the parties, agreed that the UK or Scotland should remain part of the single market and the customs union. That compromise was rejected by the British government, which again is part of the reason why you saw, and I'm just going to go back to the previous slide, why you saw the numbers didn't tick up for independence immediately after the referendum, as you might expect in 2016, but did tick up after 2019, after people had seen the chaos of the House of Commons for a number of years. And this is something that's reflected if you go into the numbers even further. What we saw, and we are continuing to see, is that we still don't know what Brexit means. Yesterday, the United Kingdom received its 5th Prime Minister in 6 years. Just to give you some context, I was 34 when I saw the 5th Prime Minister of my lifetime. My son's 5.5, and he has now reached that landmark in his life of seeing 5 Prime Ministers in the period in which he's been alive. So you see that's something that's very uncommon in UK politics. That's something that's that is changing. And then the economic decline, which was warned by the Treasury of that decline, and also the spiral of decline. There was an article in The Atlantic yesterday noting that the United Kingdom is now one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. The quote was that that we've got bad weather and a bad economy, which isn't great. But that economic decline is really important, because what's a great driver in conflict, what's a great driver in division in society? It's poverty. Poverty drives, I remember this from my old time working in conflict, poverty is something that drives division, it drives conflict in our society. Inequality. It's why the European project, in my opinion, is so important. Solidarity is so important. Why was enlargement so important in 2004? Because you wanted to stabilise countries in the east of Europe so that they became wealthy and less, and could reach the living standards that we all enjoy, as a way of minimising the chances of conflict. So this becomes really important. And in 2019, the Conservative Party again collapsed in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, the two parts of the United Kingdom which had voted to remain in the EU, but did very, very well in England, won its seats in England. And what was interesting, it was winning seats in areas that had been historically Labour, so you're seeing areas in the United States would be referred to as the Rust Belt, but in the north of England, poorer, less developed seats, people that liked Brexit. So people like Brexit who were against immigration, who hadn't seen the benefits, and incidentally this is a real challenge for any of us who believe in the European Union, that benefit has to be spread out if you want that European Union to succeed. So you were seeing a party, and especially under Boris Johnson, that a number of European politicians, and I remember Philippe Lambert, a Belgian member of the European Parliament, talking about the Conservative Party and the UK government had become an English nationalist party. That was a view reflected amongst a lot of people I spoke to in European parliaments. There are other views. I have one view. There are other views on this, of course, but that was certainly reflected in the demographic, and you see that in terms of that English identity, which had become very, very important. Just before I go on to Scotland and the changing attitudes, I'll talk a little bit about Scottish identity. Now, I don't have this figure to give you, but just to reflect identity. In 2010, 44% of people in Scotland believed they were Scottish, not British. In 2019, within 9 years, very short period of time, might not seem it, very short period of time, 77% of people in Scotland consider themselves Scottish, not British. And that's not just people like me who are Scottish by birth. This goes across all of the Scots, people who are Scots English, Scots French, Scots Asians. This cuts across. The most popular party in Scotland for people who were born in England is the SNP. There's a plurality, not a majority, a plurality of voters in a recent survey. So when I talk about identity, I want to be clear. This isn't identity based on questions of ethnicity. It's a question based on affinity and of civic identity, and that's critically important. That's really important, and especially it ties in with that political issue around immigration and the questions of immigration. So this is a country that sees itself as having, you know, more than 3/4 of the population see themselves as having a Scottish identity, but it does not matter where you came from. So it's not populist identity, sorry, but if that's the best way to explain it. So it's not populist identity. And actually, you know,
it's an art film.
It is, and we see it, for example, there's a big Scots-Italian diaspora, and they're Scottish. You know, I have parliamentary colleagues who are Scots-Italians. This is a really important distinction, and it's actually where you see, and I'll talk about this shortly, it's where you see that fit with the European model, and why the European Union has always been something that's been slightly more popular in Scotland than elsewhere in the United Kingdom. So after this chaos, and I'd be really happy to talk about the chaos, I was in there, I was part of cross-party efforts to reach a solution, to try and find some kind of compromise. I sponsored legislation which was passed with colleagues from the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats and Green Party, as well as the Northern Irish parties and the Welsh parties, that meant that we blocked the UK leaving the EU without a deal, which would have been catastrophic, because it would have been the UK leaving, and all the ties in justice, the economy, every walk of life would have just collapsed at the same time. Really important that we recognise, and I'm sure you'll do this in other classes, how interconnected we are as European states now, and how interconnected we are as European citizens. So we blocked that no deal. That was important, didn't solve the problem, didn't stop us from leaving, but it blocked that no deal. Anyway, when all of this was going on in the House of Commons, all that chaos and mayhem was going on in the House of Commons, in Scotland you saw changes. And I want to read something out for you. When the Brexit referendum was held in 2016, how people voted in Scotland bore no relationship towards their constitutional status. What that means was that how you voted in the European referendum bore no reflection on how you might vote in the independence referendum. And again, the social attitude survey, which is really important, in 2016 showed that 44% of those who voted Remain were in favour of independence, and 45% of those who voted to leave the European Union were in favour of independence. So there was no clear difference in 2016 between Scots who voted to remain in the European Union or Scots who voted to leave, and how they approached the constitutional question. It helped that the overwhelming majority of Scots voted to remain, but actually there was no discernible difference. That changed, and now the recent social attitude survey shows 65% of Remain supporters say that they support independence, and just 22% of Leave supporters take the same view. So what you've seen, as these numbers have ticked up for independence, this is being driven by the UK's decision to leave the European Union. This has been driven by a desire to return to the European Union. Now, we can have our debates and discussions about if that's right or wrong, if Scotland should be independent or not. That's fine, that's a political issue, but what we need to understand is what's driving this. And European Union membership is having a consequential decision, a consequential impact on how people see themselves and on how people are voting in one part of the United Kingdom. And why is Scotland different in its attitudes to the European Union? Well, there's history, and actually if we go back to Braveheart, that some of you recognise, there is one letter in existence in the hand of William Wallace, or Mel Gibson. William Wallace, a historical character who Mel Gibson played. And that letter is called the Letter of Lübeck. Lübeck's a town in Germany. And the one letter that we have in his hand was written just after the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The battle is represented in the film without a bridge on a field, but anyway. And in that, there was a letter written in October 1297, about the first letter that William Wallace would have written as the leader of when Scotland re-established its independence, and it was written to the Hanseatic League, the European Union of its day. And in that letter, it said, Scotland's regained its independence, we're time for us to rejoin the Hanseatic League. And interestingly, there's even a grouping in the EU that described itself as the new Hanseatic League, made up of the Baltic states, the Nordic states, the Dutch and the Irish, all of Scotland's near neighbours. So this is really important. This relationship with Europe has always been important, and being a filius specialis of the Catholic Church, again, an important part. I think that what also helps is the European Union requires states to be comfortable with pooling and sharing. of sovereignty. As I think that's something that smaller countries are quite used to. Scotland's population is about 5.5 million. That would be a medium-sized European country, so about the same size as Ireland, Finland, Denmark, Slovakia. Belgium's about 10. So it sits in about the middle. It would be a medium-sized European state. And interestingly, the Irish often talk about how they didn't have true independence until they were a member of the European Union. The Baltic states, this is really important, talk about an independence they only regained in the 1990s, that the European Union membership was pivotal to their independence, their sovereignty, and it strengthened their independence. And actually, when Jeremy Hunt, the previous UK Foreign Secretary, compared the EU to the Soviet Union, there was outrage in the Baltic states, who of course had suffered dreadfully under the Soviet Union and saw the democratic institutions of the EU as underpinning their hard-won independence. So I think the size of the country matters. It's not for me to comment on Italian, French, German politics. I know about Scotland and the UK, but the size of it really matters. And also the European treaties. It doesn't matter if you're Malta with 400,000 citizens or Germany with 85 million citizens. You sit at the same table with the same rights under the treaty, and you sit as equals and partners. This is really important because Scots get the difference. The EU is a club for independent states. The UK isn't. In the European Union, every state gets a government it votes for. Even if you might not like that sometimes, every state gets a government it votes for. Scots would argue they don't. The Conservatives have dominated the United Kingdom. Scotland hasn't voted for the Conservatives since, they haven't won an election in Scotland since 1955. You'd have to be 89 years old to have voted in an election when the Conservatives won in Scotland. The European Court of Justice is there in the European treaties to resolve differences between the states and between other actors. There is no such mechanism within the United Kingdom. Critically, Article 50, which you'll all know about, the reason we know about Article 50 was because the UK triggered it. Article 50 to leave the European Union can be triggered by any state at a time of its choosing, not a time of the European Union's choosing, as the UK demonstrated. No such article exists within the United Kingdom. You're locked into that union whether you vote for it or not. So again, these things might sound quite academic to you in terms of the constitutional makeup of the United Kingdom and the EU, but the difference in the EU and how it operates becomes pivotal in how it's seen from outside and how it influences our domestic politics. I'm going to talk briefly, and I'm going to try and open this up to questions. I want to talk briefly about Ireland in this. I'm here to talk about Scotland, not an Irish. I'm not sure if there are any Irish in the room. Anybody from Ireland? No, good.
Good to know.
So if I'm wrong, I'm not going to get contradicted. Because you don't want to get it wrong in Irish politics, although the Irish will disagree and contradict themselves sometimes. Ireland is Scotland's closest neighbour historically. The Latin name for Ireland was Scotia, because that's where the Scots came from. We're very close. My family were Irish, a lot of Scots will have Irish citizenship. It's seen profound economic growth and independence since it joined the European Union. Support for Ireland leaving the European Union is in single digits. Something like 7 or 8%. We're talking about, the same percentage of people who in the United States believe that Earth's flat or Elvis lives on the moon. We're in that kind of territory. And even though Ireland feels quite a little bit isolated, Ireland got its way in the European Union and was seen as a diplomatic superpower both in Brussels and in Washington, DC. There's a special relationship between Scotland and Ireland, but in fairness, from Ireland's perspective, its most important special relationships exist in the European Union and in Washington. I was in Boston last week, and Ireland's everywhere. From the famine monuments to the senior political figures who are represented. Joe Biden refers to himself as being Irish. There will be no trade deal between the United Kingdom and the United States unless the Northern Ireland protocol issue is resolved. Ireland's a powerful actor in its own right. That being said, Irish reunification probably causes more problems
than Scottish independence. And I say that why? Well, and I don't want to talk too much about Ireland, but just in terms of perspective, Ireland is a critical European actor. But in terms of Irish reunification, remember, Ireland's smaller than the UK. There will always be, if there's Irish reunification tomorrow, there will be a very significant part of the population who will be opposed. You've had recent histories of violence, which never existed in Scotland, incidentally. We're very dull. We've never, in recent, in the past 200 years, we've never had this history of violence in terms of our political differences. They are, remain political differences. Independent Scotland is not worth one bloody rose. It's not worth any violence. In Ireland, there's been that trickier background, but there are also more, as I understand it, not only are there more crossings between Northern Ireland and Ireland, so the external border now of the European Union, than there are between Scotland and England. Scotland and England, there aren't that many, because both sides, the border between Scotland and England was established in 1270 in the Treaty of York. It is the oldest consistent border anywhere in the world. In Northern Ireland, there are 300, something like that, which now means there are more borders, there are more crossings on the European Union's western border, which exists on the island of Ireland, than the whole of the EU's external border on its eastern side, which goes from the Finnish-Norwegian border in the north all the way down to the Greco-Turkish border in the south. More external crossings on that one island than the whole of the eastern flank. So these issues are really, really tricky. Ireland, our nearest neighbour, is ingrained in the European Union. It obviously, I think, would want to see the UK being closer and Scotland to be closer to the European Union, but Irish reunification remains a significant, challenging issue. So what comes next? And this is where I'll try and round up my remarks. Sorry, there's been so much, so please forgive me. What comes next? I'm going to go on to the last slide for something. I didn't want to do too many slides, and I'll come on to this in a moment. The SNP continues to win elections in Scotland. It continues to be popular despite the fact it first came to power 15 years ago. So that's 15 years of government by one party, 15 years of remaining popular. That's unusual in any European democracy, and is driven because people in Scotland divide according to independence. The question of independence requires how you vote. Brexit and leaving the European Union continues to be unpopular, and as we can see, there appear to be no discernible benefits. If anybody can tell me a benefit, please. I can't see any. If anybody in this room can see any, please say. In 2016, the SNP said that there should be an independence referendum if there was a material change of circumstances, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against its will, and that happened a few weeks later, and the SNP have won majorities in every single election since then. And there have been a lot of elections since then. I have some experience of that. So there is a huge question. What constitutes, if this is a voluntary union in the United Kingdom, what constitutes a mandate? So if people consistently vote for something, how will this resolve itself? Because it's not going to be resolved by ignoring it. In terms of Scottish accession to the EU, which would be the #1 foreign policy priority of an independent Scotland, this matters. The question of mandate matters. Spain and other EU countries would want to see, the rules-based system being respected, the international law being respected. So Spain and other European countries have been very clear. They've got no problem with Scottish accession to the EU and Scottish independence if London has no problem with it. So that means an agreement between London and Edinburgh is incredibly important. And interestingly, the Spanish said, look, the views of the socialist government and the popular government were exactly the same. You know, Scotland votes for independence and it's recognised by London. There's no problem with that. However, Article 50 does not exist in the UK, and this is an issue that has to be resolved. So that's Scotland's #1 priority. But if Scotland does gain independence, there are some significant questions. And I'll touch upon this briefly because I know you're looking at European foreign policy. What might Scottish foreign policy look like? Which is part of the reason why I wrote this book, to explore some of these questions. For me, roughly speaking, it looks, England will remain its most important relationship. That relationship will remain the most important, just as it has for Ireland, or it has even in some ways for Norway. But I think in terms of defence and security, it will look more like Danish and Norwegians, looking to our west. In terms of European policy, it will look more like Ireland, to our south and east. The diaspora will become incredibly important. Scotland's got a diaspora of about 60 to 70 million people all around the world. Important links to the English-speaking world, the United States, Canada, Australia. They won't go. But actually, what Scotland might do is, as well as providing a useful route for England and the rest of the European Union to rebuild their relationship, it might also provide a useful route for the Commonwealth to engage with the European Union, as the UK often did in the past, given those links, and Scotland would seek to remain part of the Commonwealth. The diaspora helps with that as well. That being said, the focus would be on the European Union with a slimmed down embassy, probably looking a bit like Ireland, with about 80 or 90 representations around the world. In terms of issues like Ukraine, there's full support for military action and selling military equipment to the Ukrainians. There's an important Polish and Ukrainian diaspora in Scotland that's been pivotal in that, but there is a recognition that you do not invade another sovereign country. And also Scotland has taken in 25% of the UK's Ukrainian refugees, of the refugees in the UK, compared to just having about 9% of the population. So a much bigger share of the refugees have come to Scotland from that particular conflict as well. I think there are also questions for the future of the European Union. The EU has moved on, but the UK remains, you can't ignore that island. It's there. It's an important partner. The UK is also, along with France, one of the two significant military powers in Europe, and that's been important in terms of the response to Ukraine. So could security be the way to help the UK and the rest of Europe rebuild the relationship, because it is not it's an area where the EU has a role, but actually the main role still rests with the member states. Interestingly, and I'd encourage anybody to read it, after the fall of Kabul in 2021, and I wrote this in a book called Losing Afghanistan, edited by Brian Bravati, I wrote a chapter in a book which argued that actually the way to reset UK, and I'm now talking about UK-EU relations, was through security. Was that I thought Ursula von der Leyen's speech, her State of the Union speech in September 2021, please read it if you get the opportunity, talks about a different European foreign policy. You may have discussed it already. A different role in terms of security. That was after the fall of Kabul. And if there was a reassessment of European security in the aftermath of the fall of Kabul, then what does that look like in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? There's only a resolution to this when the Ukrainians want there to be a resolution to this. So we're going to see war in Europe for the years to come in that conflict in Europe. And if you think about the Baltic states, and if you think about Poland, Slovakia, Romania, this is an existential threat to those countries. And they are members of the European Union with as much say as Germany, Italy, France do. And this will remain their number one foreign policy priority. And I kept saying to people in Scotland, for example, it might seem a long, long way away from Ukraine. If you want to join the European Union, and these are some of the questions for us, what's Scotland's role in European security? Are we prepared to have Scottish troops being placed in the Baltics or being placed in Poland? Because that's what the member states who will be agreeing to Scottish accession will want. So actually, in some ways, the challenges are not places like Spain or Italy. The challenge is in the east. And if you look at the debate in Germany at the moment, there'll be better people than me to speak about Germany. German politics has been turned on its head right now because of this war. And that's not inconsequential. Our politics impacts on each other's politics. What also happens on membership of the Euro? What happens on Schengen? These are big questions. I think Schengen's slightly easier because England and Wales will not join Schengen. Ireland hasn't joined Schengen. I can't see Scotland having to join Schengen in that set of circumstances. The Euro, Scotland doesn't have its own currency, so cannot join the Euro. But what happens in the years to come? And Scotland has got significant issues that it needs to resolve in terms of institution building. What happens in terms of building the institutions that you need to join the European Union that we don't have at the moment? Central banks, beefed up environmental organisations, a diplomatic service. And what happens now, the Finns were able to join the EU, they were in record time. Between application and joining was 2 years and 9 months. For the Finns, that's a record time. But they've done a lot of work. Scotland has got minimal resources. It's only got about 20 or 30 officials in Scotland House in Brussels. That needs to be significantly beefed up, because if you were to ask a Scottish politician who's pro-independence, do you want to join the EU in the next 5 to 10 years, they would say yes, as soon as possible. But you need the resources to do that as well. So these are really big challenges. And the final thing that I'll leave you with is this slide here, is this isn't going away anywhere. There's a huge demographic challenge, which is this. For those of you who are interested in what goes on in the UK and interested in the future of Europe, the question of Scottish independence isn't just going to go, even if you want it to go away. The big division in Scotland is not one of ethnicity, it's not one of educational attainment, it's not one of geography, it's not one of wealth, it's one of age. If you're aged, something like 2/3 of under 55s believe in independence, and that's not changing. We're seeing no evidence that that's changing at all. 2/3 of under 55s. Where in support for independence falls is over the age of 60 because of things like identity, maybe pensions and other issues where people have concerns. So this is a question that will continue to dominate our politics, and I think Scottish accession to the EU, I think, others have a different view, is an inevitability, and it's an idea with which we have to get used to. And also the European Union has to get used to how it lives with its large partner in the West, its large partner with a big economy, even though it's getting smaller, with a big security footprint, which is getting bigger and more important, and with a continued big role to play. And at some point, English politics, and I expressly use the term English, will start to settle down and will have to start to reassess its relationship with the European Union. That might not be for a few more years and things might get a bit more febrile, but that will have to happen and that will have consequences for the rest of Europe. So, I'm sorry, I've spoken at you. I think I was asked for about 45 minutes, I may have gone over, but I was really keen to have some kind of interaction. And can I say thank you all for being so patient with me in terms of all the history and background that has to go into these things, and so grateful to be here today. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your really challenging, fruitful thought. I suppose you noted, and it's very interesting, not only the passion that Stephen put into his speech, but how important is to him some terminological point. History is important, he made clear. He was very kind, he didn't underline enough that as Scots they can say that the first king of Great Britain was James I, but was James V of Scotland. So it means that Scots can claim that the very first king of UK was a Scot.
That's right, yeah.
Although, and then there are others. But for example, even reading Nation to Nation, I noted that the terminological issue is important. For example, twice, at least during his speech, he pointed out union. He talks about union as within the United Kingdom, but look how it mirrors the idea of European Union. To the Scots, union is a concept that is very important. Not by chance, he pointed out that the EU is a kind of club, but the United Kingdom is not. And I would like very much to point another one, the concept of border. He said that the Scottish-English border has been established in the 13th century, not by chance. That area is called the borders. So it's not just something that is administrative, or if you want, but physically you realize when you pass from England to Scotland because you are crossing the border. That is a very nice area, especially if you are driving from London to Scotland by bus in the morning. And I'm thinking about myself being very young and seeing the dawn on the borders. But let's come to a very interesting point, just one of the many, to start with and to hear your questions. Stephen said something very important. He said that there is a problem with immigration. Then we said immigration is an issue that, for example, populism has really managed from even a media point of view.
Yeah.
Populism says that immigration is an invasion. And I suppose it was kind of innuendo in what you said. Not by chance he said, we looked for a cross-party compromise, etc. So this idea that as a Scotsman, he felt he had to do something to avoid this terrible disaster that was Brexit. But I would say that probably the great difference is that, you know, many times we hear that the UK is a multicultural country. That in a way it's perfectly true. Multicultural means that several cultures are present, tolerate themselves, but not necessarily they are perfectly integrated. In the sense that, think about London. You go to London, you have the borough where you know that there are people from Pakistan, you go in another borough and you know that it's a borough where there are, for example, people from Jamaica. If I understood and I don't misinterpret your thought, you were hinting at the fact that Scotland is different because it's really intercultural. Not by chance you said, our concept of identity is different. Did you realize how many times it's stressed that there is British, the concept of British, but the point is that the English define themselves English, although they should be named British. Not by chance there is a very interesting book by Kate Fox, Watching the English, and she says, and I tell you when I say English, I mean English, not British, not Scottish, not Welsh, not Northern Irish. So I think that this is very interesting. He just pointed then at the end towards the foreign policy. That is really at the heart of his nation to nation. But I suppose that really, thank you so much for so much dense quantity of information that is really opening so many windows that I'm sure it will be a very good opportunity for our students to imagine what is, by the way, another very important concept. It is always, I always stress with my students, the point of perspective. You know, apparently the Greenwich Mean Time was once the 0 degree where you were centering maps. But maps can be seen from north, from south, from east, from west. And of course, as you understood, seeing from Scotland, which is the future of our union, that is, I hope will be our union as well, is very important. So now, the floor is for you. If you have questions, don't be shy. I'm sure there are questions that you would like to ask Stephen. Oh, one there. If you can tell your name when you are asking the question so that we can address you as a human being, not just as someone in the audience.
Hello, I am Renato Pisani from this university. You mentioned that benefit has to spread if we want Europe to succeed. How the wealth produced by the European integration distributed in the UK, because you said that because of this uneven spread, some parts of England were less happy about the Union. Why in Scotland this was not felt the same way?
It's a really good question. Thank you. It's a really good question.
Thank you.
And I'm really glad you picked up on that because actually I'm somebody who's passionate pro-European. Passionate pro-European, I should probably go off. But the European Union is not perfect. Many failings. And I want to tell a story when I answer this question. I will answer this question. These divisions also exist in Scotland. So in the constituency, constituency is an area that I represented. There were 2 towns the same size. One is St Andrews. You'll all have heard of St Andrews. It's home of golf, famous university, very international. When I was talking in the EU referendum, I was campaigning in St Andrews. No, everybody, why would you want to leave the European Union? Look at all the benefits, look how well we've done.
And there's another town, same size in the same constituency, called Leven. Few of you will have heard of Leven. In Leven, it was an old coal mining town. It never recovered after the closure of the coal mines, like other parts of Europe and North America. I campaigned there. What's the point in the European Union? What's it ever done for us? And I struggled to give an answer to that. So, I don't think the views were entirely different, but because of the fact that people could understand the issue of immigration wasn't an issue in Scotland, the issue of pooling and sharing sovereignty wasn't as much of an issue, but the issue of solidarity is one that was as applicable to Scotland as it was to England, and the principle of solidarity is probably one that applies to Italy and every country in Europe as well. I think the European Union did as much as it could in terms of regional payments, be it to rural areas, to less developed areas. I think it's why putting money into countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Romania is so effective. Because if your neighbours become wealthier, then you have somebody to trade with. You know, you can sell them cars, or they can come on holiday here, or they can study here. So I'm really glad you picked up on that. So it was probably something that Scotland we didn't discuss as much as we should have done, and it wasn't as consequential to the outcome. And I'm not giving you much in the way of data-based evidence, I'm just giving it as my first-hand evidence. But I think it's a question that we really need to think about. But there are no right answers. This is always, look, you go back to the dawn of time, there have been questions about people feeling unhappy with there being a lack of solidarity. We live in amongst the most equal times that we have ever lived in, but they're still not equal enough. So the question did play out in Scotland, but it wasn't quite as consequential. And also this question of immigration became important. So I think there was a challenge in some communities who thought that immigrants are coming over and taking their jobs, which is never the case. Immigrants create jobs. And actually all of us, one way or another, are an immigrant. My family would have come from Ireland and Norway at some point. So it's a really good question, and you're going to be thinking about that question for a while, which is good for me. But that question of solidarity must be a live question, and it just didn't play as much of a role in Scotland. Does that help? I haven't answered your question entirely, I understand. Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, there is one there.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Greetings, Professor. My name is Ioachim Delimitru. I'm from the University of Thessaloniki in Greece. And, well, inspired by your book title, I would like to ask you what it could be the position of Scotland in the world in the future. Because, as you mentioned, it has some problems like no national currency, limited resources, no national bank, that they are affecting the possibility of Scotland's EU accession. And if I may, one second question about the small political instability that we can see in the politics of the United Kingdom. Does the political instability in Westminster has affected the Scottish society's perception of the Westminster politics? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim.
Good to have somebody from Greece. We share a patron saint, and of course in St Andrew. And St Andrews itself, where my university is, was established because a Greek monk brought the bones of St Andrews, St Rule brought the bones of St Andrews from Greece, in Patras, to St Andrews. Sorry, that's utterly irrelevant to this, but I like the interconnectivity that we all have. It's a really good question on state building. And sorry, the second bit of your question was on the chaos and the impact that might have.
Westminster on Scottish Parliament.
Yeah. Profound impact. I'm going to come to that second. I think firstly on the institution building, the reason I wrote the book, and sorry, there's so much to cover in background, I probably haven't talked enough about what's in the book as Professor might have liked, and I'd be glad to talk a little bit more about that as well. But In terms of institution building, a lot of that comes with being an independent state. So if you're not an independent state, you don't have a diplomatic service. You don't have representation in the European Union. The European Union doesn't deal in sub-state actors, it deals in states. You know, it's not the business of the European Union to discuss the internal politics of Greece or the internal politics of the United Kingdom. And that's been very controversial. We see that controversy with Poland at the moment in the rule of law, where Hungary, where very reluctantly the European Union has taken a stand on domestic politics. So the European Union will remain neutral. But a lot of the institutions that we lack come with state building. But when resources are very limited in government, choices have to be made. Do you put more focus into embassies, Scottish embassies, which the Scottish Government is starting to do, but you can't create a constitutional court, which is part of the United Kingdom, you can't create that diplomat, you can't even create a beefed up environmental, you know, for example, European treaties would require you to have these in place, or a justice ministry, or Interpol, or any of these things, because you're not independent. So a lot of that comes with independence, but you're right, it is something that needs to be tackled quickly. A lot of the things that other countries will take for granted. In terms of the chaos, I think in terms of the numbers I showed you, the chaos has had a profound impact on Scottish public life. So in 2014, in the previous independence referendum, there was some statistics I don't have, but when people were asked about independence, their heart was telling them yes, but their head was telling them no. Well, now it's shifted because their head and their heart are telling them the same thing. And what happened was the UK said, look, the United Kingdom is a stable, respected part of the country. You can play a full role. We're a full member. You can only protect your European Union membership if you remain part of the United Kingdom. That doesn't apply anymore. And even on questions like pensions, which is really important. Well, we've seen the value of a UK pension collapse. We've seen the standard of life come down. And these political issues have severe consequences for how people respond to them. Does that help? Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Luana. I am Italian Peruvian, that's why the accent. But I have a question. I came from the other part of the world, literally. I am from the University of San Ignacio de Loyola, but I have lived the last winter in California. And I have a question, and right now, during this semester, I'm studying the global history of energetic, mainly in Europe, and right now I'm also being part of the anxiety caused by that energy crisis. And I have a question about what is the perception about the United Kingdom about the energetic crisis, because the United Kingdom have an important role before the Brexit in the European Union institution. But right now, European powers are struggling to dialogue and put a solution to Russia's actions. That's my question. Thank you.
It's a good question. And look, you don't have an accent at all. I'm sitting here in front of you trying to tone down my Scottish accent for the benefit of you all, and failing. So please, nobody should worry about their accents apart from me in here. Sometimes when I'm in London, they struggle to understand me. Really perceptive question. I look into this a little bit in the book around Scotland, where Scotland would sit. First of all, I'll look from a Scottish and UK perspective. You know, the UK leaving the EU is a tragedy. I say this, you know, I'm somebody who's always believed in Scottish independence and has benefited the political cause that I agree with, others disagree. That's fine. But the UK was a force for good within the European Union. It's my strong belief. It's a force for good, and I think the European Union is better off with the UK in it. Energy is a really good point. So, Scotland, we have an energy crisis. The whole of Europe became far too dependent on Russian hydrocarbons, far too dependent. We see the consequences of that right now. You know, at the start of the war in Ukraine, we as Europeans were still paying hundreds of millions of euros every single day into the Kremlin's finances, which were then going directly to buy guns and tanks and missiles to be fired at civilians in Ukraine. Just reflect on that for a moment. That we as Europeans, who like to think of ourselves being apart from that conflict, has a degree of culpability in that. And our culpability did not end there. Our culpability goes in the fact that if you look at the London financial markets, the amount of dirty money that was going through those financial markets. If you look at disinformation and the polarisation of our debate, which is why I'm always very strong that, you know, I have friends who passionately believe in Brexit, and I have friends who passionately believe in Scotland remaining part of the Union, so we disagree, but they're friends. The polarisation which has crept into our politics, I'm sorry to veer off topic a little bit here, but the polarisation that's crept into our politics is a part of a disinformation campaign. We see that in the United States. You've got some experience. You've got experience of that. That's really damaging. If we all agreed with each other, life would be very dull, and we wouldn't really live in a democracy. Democracies rely on us disagreeing, because we disagree, we debate, we listen, and then we come up with better solutions. And on energy, I think the European Union's turned it around. I see that the European Union reliance on gas from Russia has decreased down to about 9% now. Still means we're paying money to the Kremlin, but it's reduced. Scotland's role would be, so Scotland has got huge renewables resources and still has big hydrocarbon resources. Scotland has decarbonised its electricity sector. It did it in 2019. So our electricity sector comes from a wide range of sources, but it's decarbonised. But actually our foreign policy objective, because we've got where Scotland, although it's a small country, every country's got different things. It's the strength of the European Union. What does Scotland bring? Well, its world-leading sectors are finance, education, food and drink, and energy. And that's why a key Scottish foreign policy objective would be a single energy market. So rejoining that single European market in energy would be pivotal. And just in the way that Norway is plugging the gap for the rest of the European Union, Scotland would contribute to it because it's a big net exporter of both renewable and oil and gas, if that makes sense. So that would be, when we talk about priorities, which again I know I should have probably talked a little bit more about, that would be one of them.
Question?
Yeah.
My name is Stella Alonso. I'm also from Greece. My question is, what does the appointment of Rishi Sunak as the new Prime Minister mean for Scotland?
Wow, it only happened yesterday. So, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, the reason that I use the statistics for young people shows that regardless who's Prime Minister, it doesn't change people's views. Young people, when I say young people, I'm meaning anybody up to the age of 60. So it's quite I use the term young, for me, reassuringly widely. I don't think it's making any difference, you know. So I think that Scotland will continue to diverge. The polling numbers don't seem to show any difference. I don't think it makes any difference. Scotland continues not to matter the Westminster system. Prime Ministers are elected by the votes of English MPs. Sorry, that's a very short answer. I don't think it makes any difference. And in those foreign policy divergences, I'm not sure it will make a difference. What are Scotland's foreign policy priorities? Energy, climate change, climate justice, taking a bit of leadership around that. On the loss and damage fund, membership of the European Union, again, and engagement with the diaspora and growing the economy. And on those foreign policy objectives, Scotland will continue to do its thing regardless of who's in number 10. Number 10 being, sorry, the residence of the British Prime Minister.
Yes. And there is a question for me.
Please.
Professor Christian from Greece also. I would like to ask you, because I think the SNP has a very seamless agenda plan. Like there are proposals, let's say, from Gordon Brown about reforming the Westminster system that you say and moving into a cloud. So if we want to, let's say, to make the House of Lords as a constitutional assembly, or making other adaptations, so why the SNP keeps focusing on the independence? It's a political decision, whatever. Second, what makes you believe that you can skip the line for joining the EU from other states like Montenegro or Serbia, but you will be the preferred ones? And thirdly, I would like to ask you, like, there is a perception of London as an enclave in England or in the UK, but the poorest areas in the UK are Barring and Dagenham, which are in London. So England has the same problems with Westminster as Scotland. So it's a common battle.
So, good question. Why does the SNP focus on independence? I'm not party spokesperson anymore, but it focuses on independence because that's why people vote for it. And if you're going to be a successful political party, then you reflect the views of the people who vote for you. In the same way, the Conservative Party is mainly elected by people who voted to leave the European Union. So despite all the problems we know with Brexit, they reflect the people who vote for them. And if you stop reflecting the people that vote for you, they stop voting for you. And then you're out of power. So I think it's a good question, but that's why. You know, the desire of those who vote for the party, and again, the SNP wins all these keeps winning elections, is because the population of Scotland votes along constitutional lines. In the last Scottish parliamentary elections, there was a Centre for Constitutional Change did a survey at Edinburgh University, a fine university, and they found that only 4% of the electorate, 4%, voted for a party with different views from their own on the constitutional question. 4%, which means pretty much everybody. If you're pro-union, you vote Liberal, Labour, Conservative. So if you're pro-independent, you vote SNP or Green. So that's the first one. On the question of queues, as commissioners keep saying, there is no such thing as a queue in the European Union. Look, Turkey, if it was a question of queues, Turkey would have been in long before Slovenia, Austria, Sweden, Finland, you name it. You know, if Iceland wanted to join the European Union, do you think they're going to go in a queue behind Montenegro? I don't. And actually, or if Norway wanted to join. So the question is whether or not you've met the acquis communautaire. Now, Scotland met the acquis communautaire for 40 years. And on the acquis communautaire, yes, there are questions about institution building that we raised, but there's not a question of queues. So the question of queues doesn't exist in the European Union. I mean, Turkey joined the queue in 1957. Was it 57? Or in the 1960s, forgive me, but it was quite a long time ago. There's no question of queues. You know, some of these countries didn't even exist as independent entities when Turkey first applied. So it's when you're ready, it's not where you are in the queue. So again, I think that's something that's quite important in how we consider the European Union. It's a rules-based organisation, it's when you meet the rules. On the final question on solidarity, it's a good question. There's poverty across the UK, there's poverty in Greece, there's poverty in Ireland, there's poverty in Belgium. That's why the European Union is so important. Questions of solidarity are so important. Yes, I care about poverty in Newcastle, but I also care about poverty where I used to live in Antwerp. I care about poverty in countries closest to me in Ireland. So this is a great thing about the European Union. It takes down these borders in terms of tackling these common problems. What makes poverty worse? One thing in the UK, leaving the European Union. Makes the UK more unequal, makes it poorer, and that means it's got less wealth to spread around. These areas have gone poorer that you refer to. Food banks have gone up quite significantly in the UK. I live in quite a wealthy part of the UK. My old constituency of 60,000 people, in a wealthy, very wealthy constituency, 8 food banks. Poverty is everywhere.
and it's about what's the best mechanism of tackling that poverty. But I'm really glad that you raised it. It's a really good point. It's one that I think about and I wrestle with. And thank you.
Yes, maybe a question.
Please, yeah.
Yes. Okay, so my question is on the Scottish National Party.
Yeah.
And which is, of course, pro-European, but what kind of European Union does it support? Which model of European integration does it support? Is there any, in terms of supranationality, as far as the direction of European integration is concerned? And is there any debate within the party? Maybe it is, I guess, you know, and so on, because it is very important to understand this if the Scottish National Party wants to be part of the European Union. So what kind of a European Union? That's my question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm sorry we've run out of time almost, but it's a great question because we could be here discussing this the whole time. I'll be honest, the debate on this is relatively weak at the moment. That's why courses like yours are so important, because that knowledge of the European institutions, debating and discussing it and actually disagreeing, and it's not the intention of your question, I hope your students will regularly disagree with you, because it would be an unhealthy state of affairs if we agree or disagree. Our debate around the European Union should be a lot better. The lack of understanding is very poor. When I was in the House of Commons, there were 5 of us out of 650 who'd worked in the European institutions. There were Conservative MPs, and I know this about Scotland, who didn't know the difference between the Commission and the Council. There were ministers who didn't know the difference between the Commission and the Council, or even what a customs union was. So the decision to leave the EU was made in terms of one of profound ignorance. And even if it was the right decision, which I don't agree it is, even if it was the right decision, you should never take a decision in terms of profound ignorance. Where we are in Scotland is, I suspect we're closer to Ireland in terms of outlook, which is we support an enlarged European Union. We support one where the states still hold a great deal of power under treaties. So the one that is currently supported is confederal. And so it is the European Union as it exists at the moment. I don't think there'd be less of a problem in Scotland with enlargement than there is in other countries. Not least because enlargement for our neighbours means Iceland and Norway, you know, and enlargement further away has pure consequences for us. So it's one where we regain freedom of movement, where the treaties apply, where you're respected as a member state. I think you can have greater European integration, but it must be done on the building blocks of the state as they exist. And also, and this is something that all of us who believe in the European Union need to think about sometimes, the European Union can only be successful when it doesn't take big jumps, because you need to take the population with you. And that means that the evolution of the European Union will continue well beyond the lifetime of anybody in this room. So that's where we are at the moment. There's a big question around the euro. My suspicion is that Scotland would seek its own currency as a newly independent state, could join the euro anyway. But I think that will become an increasingly live debate. But of course, the reason why the EU evolves is that there's always a change of government. You've just had one here in Italy. You know, that will have consequences for everybody in Europe as you're a different actor. So in Scotland, we have to recognise that what one government says in its approach to Europe only lasts for a maximum 5 years, and then you have a change, 4 years, or if you're in the UK at the moment, every 3 months. But anyway, but that's constantly evolving. But our debate is still very underdeveloped because it's seen within the constitution and internal politics rather than our place in Europe as a whole. Is that?
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't even touch upon nuclear weapons in this either.
Yes, the last one. The last one.
Yeah, I'm asking questions every time. But my name is Maria, and I'm from Russia, and I'm sorry if there are going to be like some prejudice or whatever. I'm not intending anything. However, I wanted to ask a rather skeptical question, because first, that's very lucky that you mentioned the energy being the energy capital of Europe. And as far as I know, Scotland provides like, is estimated to provide around 60% of all crude oil in Europe, and being like an energy, like a very good reserve. However, the statistic says that 60% of crude oil, which is produced by the European Union, which is not actually a lot. Europe would not buy any energy from outside, from Arab Emirates, from Russia as well, if it would be self-sufficient. That's the first thing. And that returns to the question of being ready, of queuing to get into the European Union. Yeah, of course, European Union might be more open to countries that have been in countries, states, territories that have been historically within the Europe region. However, is that a point that European Union would think twice before accepting Scotland into its into the Union, exactly because of the problem of UK not wanting to let Scotland go, and that would firstly cause a huge trouble between two states, because UK is a huge power still, economical and political in the European Union, and Scotland is not really. So it's great that people want to be independent. People want to be independent in many countries, Balkan countries, Spain and other regions, but maybe what electorate wants is not exactly what is sufficient to do in politics.
Spasiba. It's a good question. I mean, this is why when I touched upon, this is why I talked so much, probably a little bit too much, but it's so important about history. And I'm not a historian, but the history is critical. So when Scotland has a different constitutional setup from, say, Spain, and let's talk about Spain rather than the Russian Federation or other entities, but when it's got a different constitutional makeup, that's important in these questions, because that's the basis on which you're having the discussion. So even UK ministers will say, well, Scotland is a distinctive entity, we live in the United Kingdom. That's pivotal, because they don't see that in Madrid. And I don't want to comment on Spanish politics or Catalan, I'm not well placed to do so, but it's where there's a different discussion and debate in Spain and, say, the United Kingdom, because it's one based on history. There was a different constitutional makeup in the former Soviet Union, which is why Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania became independent from the Soviet Union, even though at times had been part of the Russian Empire. Finland was part of the Russian Empire, and incidentally thrived in that period of independence. So I think that's where I put so much context in terms of history. On the energy, I think Scotland will be an important contributor to the energy mix. But it's where that single energy market becomes important from a European context. And actually it's why I said the Spanish aren't that bothered. But the big problem is the agreement between Edinburgh and London. And that's an internal political issue at the moment. And that's the challenge for being recognised, because you need to be, if you're recognised by London, you'll get recognised by everybody else. But that different constitutional setup within the country is pivotal, and that's why I spent so much time just setting out why we are in this situation. And it's not just an issue the British government can try and block it, but it becomes more and more difficult given that different history, that different constitutional setup. Does that make sense? Хорошо? Yeah.
Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Well,
Sorry, I've kept you from your lunch.
No, it's fine. I would like to go on forever, but I suppose they have other commitments. I have to listen. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. I just would like to point out to close. Stephen made a reference that is very extensively discussed in the book, that as an insider, he could confirm, and he mentioned that there was little culture, little English culture, I would say, about the European Union. We know that even the British people discovered what was the Union soon after, immediately after.
Yes, true. Yeah.
I suppose this is vital. It's something that we can take on. As you can see, his view is organic, is complex. Trash is simplification, culture is complex. He offered something that is a very complex view. Not by chance, one of the chapters says foreign policy without a foreign ministry. Well, in a way, it's a kind of foreign ministry. It's trying to do some foreign policy. And to hand up and to pull the leg of my dear colleague, then I should ask, but have we got a EU foreign policy? That's the real problem.
Okay.
Have a nice afternoon. Thank you so much. And thank you. Bye-bye.